Welcome to the presentation of the Global Cooperation Barometer 2025. I am Samir Saran, and I'm the president of the ORF and a member of the expert advisory board for this year's barometer. Those who have joined us in person, please collect your headsets to engage with this presentation. And those who are joining us online, a very warm welcome once again. Follow us with the hashtag wef25. The Global Cooperation Barometer is a tool developed by the World Economic Forum in collaboration with McKinsey and Company to measure the state of global cooperation. In a moment, I will turn to Bob Sternfels, Global Managing Partner of McKinsey, to share this year's finding. We will then leave about 10 minutes for Q&A, both from those who are online and those who are seated here. But before I do that, let me just make one point on why this is a very important project. We know geopolitics is complicated and it is becoming even more so. We know there are increasing levels of conflict and competition in the years gone by, and we also know we are faced with a plethora of crises: a warming planet, an economy that is struggling. We know peace and security is in shambles, and of course, we still have lots of black swans and gray swans to respond to. The barometer does not compel us to agree on everything. It tells us, or at least motivates us, to find ways of working together. It is measured across 5 key pillars: climate and nature, trade and capital flows, health and wellness, and peace and security, alongside innovation and technology. In a sense, what the barometer does is to tell us where we are and where we should be headed. Now, I'm going to be excited to learn more about this particular, the inaugural edition of this report, and I am going to turn the floor to Bob, who will walk us through the data. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Samir. And thank you.
Please. Thank you.
And thanks for kicking us off here. Hi, everybody. It's my privilege on behalf of McKinsey and Company to celebrate the second time that we've done this with the World Economic Forum. And when we set out on this idea of starting to measure global cooperation, we realized that there was no common definition to this. And before we start figuring out ways that we could cooperate or collaborate better, you need some baseline, right? You need a baseline. And so we set out to develop the Cooperation Barometer. If you delve into it, and I'll explain it more in a moment, it has 41 indicators across 5 categories. We went back 10 years to start to get a trend line to this. And this is the second year in which we've done this. As Samir indicated, I think the reason this is so important and why we're committed to continuing to do this is it allows us to keep score. Are things getting better or are they getting worse? We need some reference point as we figure out what we want to do. You have to be able to measure against this. And the barometer's humble goal is just to provide a measurement tool around this. From the measurements, does it start to give us insight as to where cooperation might be warranted? It may also give us insights as to where future concerns may lie, because some of the indicators are forward-looking. And how do we think about degradation in forward-looking indicators? Now, it comes against a backdrop where cooperation is needed now more than ever. You look at some of the existential questions that we're facing, the rapid adoption of technology and both the opportunities and disruption that may entail, complicated geopolitics, how we continue to navigate climate transition, but also fulfilling the energy needs of the global south and doing both. Demographic change that is more than any time since census was recorded in the 16th century. So there's a real need for this. So maybe without further ado, what I'll do is I'll spend a little bit of time unpacking the findings, and then we'll open up to discussion. And so if I start with the first slide, which really just lays out the pillars. So as we start to break down cooperation, how have we defined it? And as Samir mentioned, there are 5 pillars that we'd like to go into: trade and capital flows, innovation and technology, climate and natural capital, health and wellness, and peace and security. And from here, we'll get more granular, but we need to start parsing this broad notion of cooperation into some types of categories. We're refining these as we go, but there's 41 indicators under these 5 categories. And so what do we find? And I'll start at the top level. If you look at the aggregate trend in cooperation, what you find since we started recording this in 2012 is there was a rise in cooperation that in aggregate has essentially flatlined since 2020. Right? So not up, not down, flatlined in terms of cooperation. Now, there may be some good news in that because I think most people think cooperation is declining, right? And I'm going to point to some reasons why it's stayed where it is. But I'm also going to point to how this chart is very misleading because the average misses the granularity of trends underneath it, right? And so at the high level, the optimist can say, hey, right, we're still cooperating as we always have. I think a more concerning view starts to get into the detail, right? So let me then now look at the 5 pillars that we looked at, and what you see is a trend in these pillars that starts to diverge. So the good news, 4 of the 5 pillars are basically where they were pre-pandemic. And I'll talk to those in a second, with the real degradation being in peace and security, right? So at the next headline level, and I'm kind of peeling the onion on this, you'd say, hey, 4 of the 5 levers remain solid, cooperation remains high, peace and security is clearly declining, and I think we see that in the world around us when we just look at the number of conflicts that 2024 entailed. So that's kind of headline 1. But now let me get more granular because in each lever you see ups and downs, right? And so I'm going to start with trade and capital, right? So if you look at trade and capital, and I'm an optimist, so I always start with the positive sides. What you see in terms of growth is you see real growth over the last year in capital and services. Now it's offset by physical goods flow, right? So services grew, capital grew, but physical trade dropped. The largest concentration in physical trade dropping is in emerging markets, right? So we see a disruption in cooperation around physical supply chains, but a growth in services and capital. And I think we have seen some of the aspects of politicization of supply chains, right? And that's manifest in the index that we see. I might double click just also on this while we stay on this slide for a second. FDI has remained strong, and you might say, hey, that's great. People are investing cross-border, but it belies that FDI got more concentrated into a small number of developed economies. So FDI in the emerging South dropped. Right, Global South dropped, and that's kind of a concern as you think about where investment might be most needed, right? And that's masked when you look just at aggregate FDI. Let me turn to innovation and technology because you also see some ups and downs when you go to the second pillar in innovation and technology. And again, I'll look at where growth has occurred. So we see IT services continue to grow. Cross-border data flows continue to grow at phenomenal rates, right? So those things give you optimism on innovation. Individuals using the internet, in some ways, the modern access to electricity has continued to go up, which provides people opportunity to be on the online world. So all those things are on the positive side on the innovation and technology front. But the worries come in some of the indicators that might be lead indicators, right? So what you start to see is stresses in knowledge sharing around innovation. Cross-border patents and cross-border R&D have dropped, right? And those are future indicators of cooperation and innovation, right? And they should be at least yellow flags in call out on this pillar. Let me take you to the 3rd pillar, which is around climate and nature. And again, there are things to celebrate and things to call out as concern on this category. The good news is, despite a lot of the rhetoric over the last year, investment continued to flow into sustainable technologies, right? We saw a net increase in that over the course of of the last year. It was, in fact, the largest acceleration in migration and adaptation financing that we've ever seen. So you'd call out that. The carbon intensity of GDP growth also went down, right? So we are seeing progress as sustainable technologies are implemented. The worry is the rate of progress is nowhere fast enough to hit any of the goals that we've articulated. And when we did an estimate around this, it's only about 10% of the total investment required to hit our net zero commitments have actually been made. So we've moved, but we've moved 10% of the way, and there's a long way to go. If I looked at cost side of this and took a natural disaster aspect, and this excludes, I'm from California, it excludes the fires in California because that's a 2025 aspect. In 2024 alone, the insurance industry had $135 billion in cost due to natural disasters, right? And that actually is at an all-time high and likely will be exceeded in 2025 just based on California, right? So we're also seeing that on the liability side of the climate. It's coming home to cost. It's coming home to cost. Let me go to pillar 4, health and wellness. Again, things to celebrate, things to call out. The part to celebrate is on outcomes. Outcomes improved over the year. So if you look at child mortality, maternal mortality, and life expectancy, those all improved in 2024. They're great outcome-based metrics. But if you look at forward indicators, you start to get worried. And I'll call out 2 forward indicators. Cross-border R&D in life science dropped 15%. Right? So the cooperation and collaboration around investment in future health technologies is declining. Further, I would just call out the failure of the World Health Assembly to agree on pandemic protocols. So are we ready for the next pandemic to cooperate? Maybe not. Right? And those are both future indicators around this. So you see puts and takes that might say, hey, I celebrate the success we had here, but I'm worried about the future cooperation of where this might head. Let me go to the last one, which I think should be the clearest. And this was the unambiguous decline pillar, which was around peace and security. And what really drove this were geopolitical tensions, proliferation of conflicts that we've seen around the world. The IRC watch list was at an all-time high, and the duration of civil conflicts was at its highest level since the Cold War. We know all those things, and they're unambiguous declines in cooperation on this front. If you do look at let's say, the efficacy of multilateral organizations around this, 2024 was not a good year for the effectiveness of multilateral organizations in addressing these things. And if I just call out the UN Security Council, they haven't mandated new peacekeeping operations since 2014. And there were no resolutions passed, or it was 2024 was the fewest number of resolutions passed by the UN Security Council. So the mechanisms we have to deal with this, at least the multilateral mechanisms, aren't proving effective. And we're going to need to figure out some new methods if we want to reverse this pillar. So those are 5 pillars. I will close with some thoughts from the barometer when we pulled up in collaboration with the WEF to say, well, what might be ideas to improve these trends? And there were 5 ideas that I wanted to highlight. The first is we need to innovate on how we cooperate. I'll just be blunt. Organizations don't cooperate well, right? I work with a lot of private enterprise. You're just geared for the antibodies not to cooperate up and down the value chain. Public-private often misses each other, and public-public often has tough times really figuring out real collaboration. So how do we innovate on mechanisms to collaborate better? The second is what we call planned opportunism. When you see something, can you mobilize quickly to find advances to cooperate? Or do we dilly in the back and forth negotiation? How do we break that through and change the cycle time so that we can be opportune when a moment strikes to cooperate? The third is redefining proximity. And one of the things that we've done is we've looked at trade corridors around the world. And you are seeing actually the world reconnect in different ways. Some seem intuitive. So if you look at the rise of flows between the US and ASEAN, you've seen that rise. But you may not know that the rise between the GCC and Brazil,
Huge.
the rise between India
and
and
GCC.
Central Europe, actually, around manufacturing and how it's being reset, and also IT services.
Correct.
So there are new patterns and new connections here that may allow us to define proximity in different ways and reconnect the world. I love this one of think big but start small. This is the idea of if we stay in the grand, we never get going. So how do we pick places just to get start and start measuring progress? And then maybe finally, I'd close with this notion of, it's a complicated word, structural segmentation. What this means is different organizational models going forward. You know, how do we think about reimagining our supply chains? How do we think about reorganizing talent when we operate in multiple countries? How do we think about new capital structures if you operate around the world to get different sources of capital for different parts of your business in different parts of the world? There's got to be some innovation on that front if we want to unlock cooperation. So that's the report in a whirlwind. Samir, I'll hand back to you, and I think we can do some Q&A.
So I'm going to come to you in a few minutes, but let me ask Bob a couple of follow-up questions.
Please.
We see flatlining since, I think, the 2020.
Yes.
We see a flatlining. That's also when the Trump term ended. In some sense, we are at a new moment. How do you see, what would your message be to global leaders today? Is there a sign of positive future that we could work towards? Or are we beginning to see the beginning of a decline of cooperation?
You know, I think it's a fundamental question of, do you believe as a leader this is an exogenous force or an endogenous variable, right? Meaning, is this being done to me or can I affect the outcome?
Correct.
And I think what's clear since 2020 is we've had multiple shocks, right? You know, we had a pandemic. We had the invasion of Ukraine. We've had the rethinking of the world order that you and I grew up in. What it's turning to, I can't say, but it's changing, right? So one version is left to its own devices. I think you will see cooperation decay, right? But we don't need to leave it to its own devices. Many of these aspects allow us as leaders, whether you're private, public, social, to affect change. And, you know, I see this in the world around us where the CEOs that I talk to are trying to figure out, this is their version of that story. There are challenges, but there are also opportunities. And I think one of the asks that I would have to leaders watching is, how do we lean into the opportunities as well as the challenges so that we could actually ensure that this doesn't flatline, but picks up?
You know, let me turn to a very interesting slide you presented to us. You see really strong climate finance forces that are now investing in mitigation efforts, and yet you see a rise in emissions. Is that about money going to wrong places? I mean, the bigger question, what are your advice to those who are seeking to cooperate on getting the right results? You know, that slide is really telling.
Well, and look, you know this better than anybody from the part of the world that you sit in, but when you think about this challenge, often leaders talk about a trilemma that we need to solve for. We need to solve for climate change. Equally, we need to solve for energy availability. So India consumes 1/10 of the energy of the United States.
Correct.
And denying India the growth path that it's on, 7-8%, hopefully all the way through your 100th, is not the right solution here, right? So we need affordable energy, we need clean energy, and I think also what the recent events showed us is you need secure energy, that the energy supply chains, in particular if you look at Europe, were not that resilient. They were fairly fragile. And so you have to solve all three of these at the same time. And I think what that leads you to is the thinking of and-based thinking. And this is an idea that says we do need to continue to invest. From a business perspective, we need the environment and framework that says, I'm going to be rewarded for the time frame of that investment, and that there's a policy and regulatory environment that makes those investments economic. Right? So we need that. I think on the other side of the equation, we need an environment that's conducive for all of you young, bright minds out there to want to drive innovation in the space. we see enormous potential for future innovation in climate technologies. Is that going to be rewarded? And will our young best and brightest go into this space? But I think also there's an aspect of, in this balance of leaders between adapting to current environment and maintaining true to your convictions, how do you hold some line in the middle that says, I'm not abandoning these trilemma goals? And often that requires, I think, a shift in, let's start measuring year by year progress as opposed to end date aspirations. And one of the things that I like about the index is we can start getting more granular and measure this year by year.
I can go on with a few more questions, fascinating slides and the report. Congratulations for it's the second
thank you for
report
jumping
this
in
year.
on this too.
And,
It's been great.
And I'm opening it up to all of you now to post questions to Bob, those online and those here with us. I'm going to put on a ear set.
Yeah, and I'll try and listen along here so I can hear your questions. Huh?
I'll remove my glasses. It doesn't work, but I'll do well. Go ahead. Please ask your questions. Oh, there's a gentleman there.
Which channel are you on here?
Number 2.
Oh, sorry. I got to get on the right channel.
Yeah.
Are you on yet, Bob?
Are you on 2 yet?
No, it's. I don't think I have a battery.
You don't have a battery?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I can. Oh, I got one here.
Yeah.
Oh.
Thank you so much.
Sorry. It's easier to answer the question if you can hear the question.
Well, that's not necessarily true, as we all know.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Ignorance is bliss.
Sometimes people answer the question they want anyway.
Bob, one of the things that occurs to me about the analysis you've done is you could abstract from the aggregate figures certain relationships. For example, the relationship between the United States and China. And I don't know if you've done this analysis, but if you have, I'd be very interested in knowing which relationships are driving what the average figures are and which relations are driving them in a downward direction.
Yeah. It's a great question, and the answer is no. We haven't started to get to correlations and relationships driving underlying drivers, but we do have sub-data that starts to see trends. So, for example, I had mentioned that physical trade flows had dropped. The largest drop in that was U.S.-China. Right. Does that imply a correlation? Probably, but we haven't linked it that. But we've identified the atomized driver that says, look, this is one of the biggest drops in the cooperation index. And I think the reason I'm excited about the index is it allows us to start to get to granular points to then say, how do we feel about that? And then does that start to lead to thinking of what we should do about it?
So Bob, just one quick follow-up on that same question. At some point, could some wise people be looking at the cooperation index and be thinking about impact on GDP, global GDP, and how certain decisions or certain lack of decisions or partnerships are affected?
Well, there is a strong correlation if you go back to 2012 between the aggregate improvement in the index and the growth in GDP. And that's one of the correlations that we have shown, and you've even seen since 2020, right? That change. What that foretells for the future, right, is up for others to portend and predict. But I do think one of the areas of subsequent work could be then at a more granular level, do certain pillars matter more than others, right, as we think about this? And I think that's a great input for perhaps the next iteration of the barometer.
Another question here? Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Well, analyzing the historic information will help you try and forecast, after listening to Trump's speech yesterday, if it will continue in a stable line or there will be some disruptions.
It's probably too early to tell. I think is the honest answer to this. And what I would say on the one hand is one of the places that feels a little bit more certain coming out of the new administration is a move for less regulation. Right? And you've already seen some of the pronouncements. You're going to see several of the executive orders in a deregulation environment. from the 3 pieces of legislation that were passed in the past administration around infrastructure, IRA, and CHIPS Act, there's the current estimate, there's over $100 billion of capital that was committed through those that is tied up in last mile permitting and regulation. By the way, half of that comes from companies outside the US. So if I just pick one granular thread that actually says you could see potentially a bump on one of these, it might be through speeding up the deployment of capital that's already committed around that. On the other hand, one that I think is highly uncertain are around tariffs. And obviously tariffs do not drive an increase in these. So I think there's puts and takes on this, and we're going to have to get more granular as we unpack the actions of the current administration over the next little while.
Okay, so we're going to take the last question now, and we're going to turn to you.
The question is, hi. The general decline in the peace and security line, is it driving the problems around cross-border cooperation in technology, general flow of goods? I mean, is that the cause? In which case, unless that line shifts, these are never going to reverse. So, the levers that were outlined may or may not be relevant to actually stem the tide of those areas which were the lead indicators of, again, further future peace and security going down.
Exactly.
Thoughts?
It's interesting, I think in part, but only in part. And the reason I say that is when you look at the rise in conflict, clearly some of the slowdown in FDI in conflict driven or conflict near countries is understandable. So you see a drop in the trade number with a drop in the peace and security number because those are clearly linked. Others aren't as linked. When you think about cross-border patent investments, those largely so far have actually been in non-conflict geographies, right? And so when you think about the slowdown in future investments in technology, you could make a case that says, yes, I want to fix peace and security, but I could fix this one as a standalone, right? And what is driving a slowdown in that investment? And so I like these linkages, but I'd also try and not say everything is linked to everything because then it starts to slow down. Where can we actually atomize some of these for more targeted problem solving?
Bob, we have last 3 minutes. I noticed a very interesting bit of information that you presented. International students flow negative.
Yes.
Does that tell us the story of this? And you know what I'm talking about.
No,
it's basically Chinese students going to America, right?
Look, we're
and is that in many ways the story of this cooperation barometer?
Look, I have the privilege of leading a global company that operates in 70 countries. We have over 150 nationalities, and global experience is one of the key things in our own DNA. You do see a slowdown in cross-border students, particularly grad students, right? And when you actually think about the innovation potential, but maybe this is just Bob's own version pulling up from the index, the potential for better understanding each other and therefore for real collaboration, not just cooperation, I think that's one to watch and one we need to figure out.
Great. I think this brings us to the end of a wonderful session where we got a glimpse of the index. Do get a copy, do download it, do read it, do analyze it yourself, and do write about it. And Bob, thank you for doing this wonderful
Thank you.
job.
Thank you for co-hosting. This was fun.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.